Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. I know there's lots of cool stuff happening in Houston tonight, so we're happy to have you here with us this evening. My name is Mary Magsman. I'm the manager of public programs at the Menil, and tonight's program is called Evolving Landscapes of Time-Based Media. This program is presented in conjunction with the exhibition here at the Menil Drawing Institute called Lines of Resolution, Drawing at the Advent of Television and Video. It's on view through February 8th, 2026, so if you haven't had a chance to check it out, I encourage you to do so. It's really, really stunning. Our next public program that we have is related to this exhibition. It's a screening of short video works from 1960 to 80. It's on December 4th, and so we invite you to come back for that as well. Tonight, we're pleased to welcome an extraordinary group of panelists whose work span conservation, scholarship, curation, and media art. Joy Bloser is the Associate Object Conservator at the Menil Collection, and she was very involved with the exhibition here, the Lines of Resolution, and she is also a specialist with time-based media. Kelly Montana is Associate Curator at the Menil Drawing Institute, and she co-curated the Lines of Resolution exhibition with Anna Lovatt, who's an Associate Professor of Art History at Southern Methodist University. Anna was the inaugural Research Fellow at the Menil Drawing Institute in 2022, and during that time, she was researching how drawing, television, and video art were connected through the 1950s and 80s, and that then evolved into this exhibition that she and Kelly curated together. Anna is also the author of Drawing Degree Zero, The Line from Minimal to Conceptual Art, and she's a contributor to many journals. And finally, Jennifer McCoy is here from Brooklyn, New York. She's a media artist whose collaborative practice with her husband, Kevin McCoy, extends from the moving image and software into drawing, painting, and installation. Their work investigates how new technologies shape perception, memory, and cultural imagination. Their early projects include database sculptures and television clips that were filtered into categorical frameworks and diorama-like miniatures that were film sets that were activated by cameras and software. Their recent work refigures mid-century images of the American West using collaged database and AI-generated landscape. The McCoys' work has been exhibited widely, including the Pompidou Center, the MoMA, the Met, and the San Jose Museum of Art. It's held in numerous collections all around the world as well. Their honors include a Creative Capital Award, a Wired Rave Award for Art, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. Jennifer's also a professor at Brooklyn College. Together, these panelists explore how artists, institutions, and conservators negotiate these shifting landscapes of time-based media. I'll ask that you please silence your cell phones. This is being recorded. And please join me in welcoming our panelists tonight. Thank you.
All right, I am officially moderating, so I have way more questions than we will ever have time for, so buckle up. But I wanted to thank Mary Magsman for inviting me tonight and to this beautiful place that I haven't seen. And it's such a joy to be able to interview the women here on this panel about all of this art that, my art has been in dialogue with. Some of the works in this show are serious forerunners to the ideas that I've been exploring artistically, so it's a real pleasure to think about this work in this context. In the catalog essay, Anna writes about the title, Lines of Resolution, as the amount of detail a system can reproduce. So the goal tonight is to really think about both drawing and video as information, but also, what kind of information. It's so interesting that drawing can, record notes, and it can be used for ideation and speculation. It can also be expressive, obviously. So I wanted to start with Anna and just ask, how you came to focus on this super, really pivotal moment in art history where, concerns of conceptual practice and drawing and thinking about electronic drawing, like when all of these things came together. I'm just curious about your education and how you learned to, or how you came about, focusing on this like amazing synchronicity of artistic concerns.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks, Jennifer. So really, a lot of my research until this exhibition had focused on post-minimal and conceptual drawing, as Mary mentioned, and I was really interested in these experimental drawing practices in the 1960s and 70s. And then I began looking at two bodies of work, one by Dennis Oppenheim, and it's a series of videos where he and his children perform drawing for the camera, usually drawing on one another's backs and passing the line back and forward. One of them is in the exhibition. It's called A Feedback Situation. And can you hear me now? Yes. And then additionally, I was interested in the work of Howardina Pindell, specifically her video drawings. So these are drawings on acetate sheets, so transparent sheets of plastic. They include numbers, points, and arrows, and she used the static of the television screen to attach them to its surface, and then photographed the interaction between those drawings and the broadcast image. You'll see some of them in the show. They include Star Trek. She was a big sci-fi fan. Also baseball games, sumo wrestling during a period she spent in Japan, and all overlaid with these really intricate diagrammatic drawings. So that came out of my previous research, and then I began to think that both Pindell and Oppenheim are really considering how drawing interacts with the small screen. Mm-hmm. So not cinema, but the domestic screen, whether it's a monitor or a television set. Mm-hmm. And then really thinking more broadly about how artists began to incorporate electronic screens into their work when they first became available, which is really in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
All right, let's talk about that because, this era of video, analog video, is really about this, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the term raster, and it really refers to resolution in very specific ways about lines of information, which really, seems to be an obvious correlate to, the pencil. So can you explain a little bit about the technical underpinning of these two forms together?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in the exhibition, we have CRT screens, or cathode ray tube screens. And in that kind of screen, the image on screen is actually created by an electron beam that scans the screen. It's sometimes even referred to as a sweeping, a scanning, even a drawing motion. And it creates the image line by line. Some of the artists like Namjoon Paik and Carl Otto Gutz in the first room of the exhibition really sort of explore that idea of the scan line as central to their work. And then, as Jennifer said, lines of resolution refers to the amount of detail a television or video system can resolve. So I thought it was a nice title because it refers to this sort of technical, linear aspect of the televised image. But it also highlights this resolve and commitment that the artists had in really exploring these very new media, sort of just at their inception, so when they first become available to consumers.
Yeah, it was interesting in the essay, there's a couple descriptions about how, I think it was Pike and maybe Walter de Maria who were kind of innovating forms that were almost, going to be like commercial ventures. And I thought that very early kind of pioneering spirit of, art and technology, it was so interesting to see it at the very inception of artists using electronic technology at all, that it was, this kind of, building the art, but building the appliance for the art or the tool for the art, which I think is really interesting in terms of conservation and, kind of the, I don't know, Kevin and I call it running things up the flagpole, to see what you can invent. And we'll come back to that idea for sure. So for Kelly, one of the most, there's a whole like density of very, interesting feminist work in the show. I was thinking about it in terms of, the women and the body. And in 31, Beckett published this long essay on the work of Marcel Proust. And the famous quote that I came across was, "Memory and habit are attributes of the time cancer." It's very Beckett. There's a lot of Beckett being performed in New York right now, so I've gone deep. But the use of a word like cancer in this context made me think about how the body is trapped in time and how the artists inscribe the technology onto their body. And I was wondering, if you could think about the work that wrestles with the body in relationship to the new forms of electronic art, and if you could tease out some of the differences in the kinds of projects that you're showing in the show.
Sure. Thank you for this question. I have to admit I wasn't familiar with this quote, but you kind of brought up this idea of a time cancer a few days ago, and it's incredibly provocative. And I guess when I think of something as in this context, I guess where I took it was something as being a kind of cancer, something that's like replicating in an unexpected way, or something that's mutating, something that's transmogrifying. And I think as it relates to the thematic gallery of mirroring and monitoring, where we have this whole group of women who were engaging with the representation of themselves, with the representation of women as it was being broadcast to them over mass media, they're encountering these images of women that are highly eroticized, these close-ups of the face, this fragmentation of the body, very sensuous, very tactile, and ultimately kind of replicable, right? They're turning women into a kind of consumer object over television. And what they're doing is very much disrupting this image, and they're doing it through drawing and doing it in ways that are messy, like Sonia Ivakovich, she's drawing on her face and then smudging it all out. Anne Bean, with the collaboration that she did with Dove Eilath, is bordering on the grotesque. Mm-hmm. I mean,
it's like monsters.
It is like monsters. Mm-hmm. Like it's very the use of erasure becomes very fleshy in this way. You end up just having this body kind of dispersed. But I think what also I found really provocative about this idea of a time cancer is the way that which a lot of the artists, they started to think of their bodies as like kind of fused with this technology in this way. You see a lot about people talking about the camera as a kind of pencil. This was completely unexpected when Anna and I started diving into the research, with the amount of artists that were making really strong connections between the camera as being something that was very close to the hand, that was very close to touch. And we're talking about a generation of artists that there wasn't a video program when they went to art school, because the video was brand new. So they were trained in painting and drawing. So it's fascinating to see that they're extending that language into video. But even, so they're making the camera into a kind of hand, but even Marshall McLuhan talked about the electron beam as a kind of a scanning finger, and like this kind of sense of touch, the eye body, that like the eye is completing the picture of these scan lines. And so these like man and machine is kind of becoming fused in this really fascinating way. So I think there's a tremendous amount there. If there's time, I would love to hear where your mind took this idea of a time cancer. Yeah. But that's, I think it's a really, really interesting way to kind of umbrella these techniques together.
Well, and I think it's overlaid too with this idea of the domestic tool. I threw in that image of the young woman with the porta-pack because, I think a lot of the reasons that artists brought these tools into the studio were because it was called a porta-pack. But I used one of those in college, and it was not that portable. It weighed a lot. And I think they show it with the model to show like, oh, look, even the ladies can use this technology. It's a portable technology. And, and I think that this idea of having a tool in the studio that gives you feedback about, how you look and how TV creates a look, it really echoes around between, the way images of women are disseminated televisually and come into the home, and this idea of like a domestic appliance, I think, becomes really interesting. And we'll get to, all of these images of, literally TVs in studios and what that meant, both as a distraction and as a window into the world and as, and as a tool. And I think this idea of like a screen as a window into something is something that we now completely take for granted with computing and phones, and just this idea of this interconnectivity that kind of broadcast implied. So anyway, it was just a treat to see all of these, women's images, especially, Joan Jonas, who, also inserts mirrors into her practice so that it's not only the video. And that, of course, reminds me of, very early Warhol experiments where, he'd film Edie Sedgwick with film and video at the same time. And, part of it was just watching someone deal with never having seen their moving image before and watching her struggle with that and the sound and the feedback in real time. And, Jonas feels like she's discovering it in the moment. It doesn't feel presentational. It feels like, process, which is super exciting to be able to like literally watch. I mean, and I think that's why I love teaching video art, is because, and I have to try to underline this to students. I'm like, look, you're seeing original work. Like, this isn't like we have to go to a museum to see a Picasso. Like, the way we're seeing it here is the original, and this idea of duplication. Although Joy will really complicate that idea because
she wouldn't let me use the word original. I will say we had to banish it.
I mean, I actually hadn't thought this through, but there are something called exhibition copies, and I was like, what do you mean? And I hadn't really considered that. Of course, there's like, the show copy that isn't necessarily as original as the original. I don't know. You can discuss like all of these things. In fact, you are next. So yes, I'm interested in this show that we're reminded about not just the electronic signal, but TV as furniture, through artists literally, using it as drawing equipment. And I wondered if you could unpack and tell us about your experiences with this exhibition, with the actual hardware that the artists employ, especially as technology changes and upgrades. And, as all consumers of electronics, we are well aware that the pace is crazy. And, and what's so interesting is that these artists were, making this work to try to like describe time and catch time on the fly. And yet the now that they're describing is the then. But we're sort of still thinking about it as now, but it's this far in the past. So anyway, all these fun issues about time come up. I think I have slides of some of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting about working on time-based media in general, or like, and when we're doing like with these shows, we talk about video art and people think it just kind of is on the screen. You might watch video art on your computer screen, but there's an entire technological back end to this that requires upkeep and maintenance and kind of a care to present that front end of it. And so there's this whole back end technological ecosystem that goes into presenting the best possible experience of that video art. And I think what's so interesting about having this here is, the physicality of cathode ray tubes, of CRTs. The reality that they're really rare now. It's hard to find ones that have good color still. The color quality is still good, or the right kind of era. There's the '90s CRTs. There's security camera CRTs, and then there's like that home CRT that you remember your grandma had, but it's different from the one you grew up with. And so you have these connotations between these different formats of technology, and we all know that. Your flip phone versus your iPhone and type of things like that. But when you think about presenting these works, is it appropriate to show them on a LED screen? What about that electricity that's in a CRT? Like the actual, the electron gun shooting this. It's a different type of illumination. And so you think about like the actual like light that people were seeing and receiving is different from what you're seeing on LED. That version of what is digital versus what is analog. And so I think that developing as a team together and as a museum, like to start thinking about those sensitivities and to pay attention to them. And I think it was, big credit to the curators. I think when you guys presented the show, I was so excited that we would be able to present this with original technology and that you guys were on board for it, because it was an enormous task to get all of these television sets here in operation. These aren't all ours. We had to borrow, I think, 16 CRTs from the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. And so, asking to borrow their equipment that, and every hour viewed on these means it's an hour shorter on its own life. And so you think about, we are not going to see these forever. The people that know how to repair these are dwindling. And so this repair environment and the ecosystem behind it is equally as important as, the technology that you have in front of you itself. So it's like there's this whole technology back end, I think, that gets really obscured by maybe language of it's just video art, and you're like, oh, it's just on a video, and you put it in and it goes. But there's this whole kind of system that you have to make sure, because you have the right converters, have the right cables, the right ports, we all know how that goes, but think about that, rewound back to technology from the 60s, 70s.
And if I could I just talk about a little bit the images that you've been showing on the screen, because this is something that Joy and our colleague Adrian Hernandez set up here, where we were testing all of these monitors and putting the videos on the monitors to see which one was kind of a better or more kind of honest representation of the work in terms of color, in terms of light, in terms of, not only are we putting the videos in relationship to each other, but now we're putting these CRTs and the experience of the video in relation with each other. And so even here with the Avekovich, you can see the slight color differences. And that was a major one where I think I first really started to understand these are the kinds of differences Joy was telling me was going to happen, which is why we need to test all these things and find the one that's the more appropriate color. But then to your point, Jen, I think the thing that kind of blew my mind is that Anna and I had spent so much time trying to understand the first kind of presentation, to get back to not the original, but the optimal, an optimal presentation, or get back to the kind of the rawest version of this. And then we're in there, and then there's just dials on the front, and you just change the color. And it was oh, right, it's always been the end user that has decided. It's never been. It's and to your point, it's you're seeing the thing, and there is a kind of incredible generosity, I think, to people working in video, because they also, in some ways, sort of understood that there was a certain point when, and different artists exist in different places on the spectrum, but for some of them it was really we're just gonna adjust the color on it right here, and that's the decision that we're making.
Well,
Hopefully
and it really
an
flies in the face of, sort of the gallery, the art world, where there's supposed to be a definitive version. I saw a kind of hilarious lecture by a Russian curator who was talking about a Pipilotti wrist installation, and said that the last minute, the whole show was done, but that the installation was terrible, and then she came and she adjusted the projector, and it was genius. And I was like, that is the touch of the artist, there. And I was really charmed the way you have it installed with the little plastic shields so that people can't touch, because buttons now mean I will touch this, you know?
Yeah.
And they do things, as I just said.
And they do things, all those buttons do things, some of them irrevocably so.
No. Yeah, this piece that I will show you that Kevin and I did, this was the piece that actually was profiled in art form, because even though I am alive and I don't think that old, this piece was really difficult to preserve and show, because, as artists do, we're throwing together basically consumer grade electronics to make a test. And we thought, well, I think this is an interesting idea, but, until you go 40 steps down the road, you're not even sure you're going to show it, let alone it's going to be acquired by the Met. And there's a copy of it here in Houston as well. And so this is called Every Shot, Every Episode. And, I wanted to just talk about from an artist's point of view, when a museum starts to think about, the amazing idea of we're going to, acquire this and preserve it forever, like what that entails. And, there were just a bunch of interesting, disconnects between, what we were thinking in the way of museum, at least in the past, and I think now it's changed a little bit, and this is why people now press buttons. We had thought of this as basically a DJ kit. So the idea was, and I can show you a slide. So what this piece is this is every single shot from the first season of this television show called Starsky and Hutch. So I thought we invented this idea of making art about TV until I walked into the show and saw the Adrian Piper piece from '78 where she's working with Peyton Place. But the idea was we were thinking about how narrative logic is different from a database. And so this was 2001, right? So digital video wasn't really anything yet. I remember laptops being up on bricks trying to get, the digital video even into the computer. So we were working from VHS tapes that we bought at one of those record clubs, like Columbia Records. So we bought the entire season. We developed a software that would basically unedit it. And so it's kind of a linguistic piece. So all of those discs have categories. So we took apart every single shot from every single episode, which is why it's called Every Shot, Every Episode. And there's 278 categories. Every technical advice, every rescue comes a little bit from structuralist film theory. So there's also close-up, long shot. My favorite, every reaction shot, because once you take it out of the narrative context, it's just people going, and kind of reacting to each other. So, we showed this once. Malcolm, who was at the Met at the time, and a bunch of curators were we're going to acquire this. And the next I heard, it was on the wall, and I was well, are people going to be able to change the discs? And I think I was told, Jen, this is next to a Chagall. If they can't touch the Chagall, they can't touch this. And then I was okay, well, it's their piece now. You kind of walk away from it, and it goes into history. And then the next call was well, we can't hear the sound through the air holes. And I'm what do you mean air holes? And they had constructed this whole plexi sarcophagus for it. Because, we'd shown it in an artist-run space where people were pawing at it and changing discs and doing all these things. And so it changed so much. And now there's been this major restoration and all these questions that Joy talked about. Some of it artist intention, is it the work? Is it the artwork if you change this? Is it still the artwork if it's if it's on a screen? And for us, I think it was hard because to me, you've got to be able to see the categories and intellectually think about it. But the player needed to go. It just isn't going to be able to play those discs. This was the first database piece we made. DVDs were not even pressable then, so these were video CDs, tiny little bits of data and information. And so now it's the computer kind of subsumed it and it becomes a database. But the idea was about visualizing a database. But there were so many little steps that had to be taken on the part of the Met. I think we created 3 or 4 jobs. So I was feeling very proletariat.
And when you talk about those aspects in conservation, we've kind of brought this down to thinking about those aspects as called the work defining properties. So, we're asking artists a lot okay, especially in conceptual art or these things, instruction-based art or installation art, there's all these things that kind of defy the museum, sculpture, or painting. And so what actually is the integrity of the artwork? Does it matter that it's on that player? Is that a work-defining property? And so we're using this to see if is it a work-defining property that the public gets to change the scene? And if it is, then we need to take off the bonnets and make sure that this is an interactive piece, if that's part of it. And so it's been interesting now to see a bigger push and for museums to start to understand that we have to have these conversations with artists at acquisition to make sure that we don't, kill an artwork in a sense, you don't want to put it into a format that it was never never part of the piece, or actually it's lost its integrity of it, And so that maintaining the integrity is through defining its work-defining properties.
Mm-hmm. Were there major judgment calls you had to make for this show?
I think what's interesting is that it was a lot of questions back and forth. So, we come up to something and be does this matter? is it going to matter? With the Sarah piece projected on the wall, it's a really low resolution film, and there's no more film to restore, so it's the best we got, and perhaps, Sarah might have wanted that a lot bigger, or did he want it smaller? And does the resolution of the projector matter? And then it was interesting because once we got this projector in and we kind of like made these decisions about what the size could be based on the very real technical limitation of the resolution. But then also you guys did some great research and be like, oh, this has been many different sizes. So the size wasn't necessarily so important. But then one day we had kind of set the volume, and we'd had another discussion in there, and someone turned down the volume because they needed to do something else. And we realized we didn't have any idea how loud this needed to be. And, the projection is him like grabbing these sheets of paper off the wall. So you can kind of hear this ASMR kind of ripping of paper. And how loud should it be, and there's the real need of the artwork to exist alongside other artworks. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of interesting to see how those, it's basic, it's just a projection and some sound, but it's never just that simple. And making sure that we're presenting it in a good way. Because the other thing is that maybe people would see the image, that you have here, and, in 100 years say that's a good way to show it because the Met showed it that way. So there is a certain responsibility on the part of the museums to get it right, because it's going to get repeated because we did it. And that's the research, and that's why it's so important. And I sometimes feel bad about like sticking my feet in the sand and saying, no, we really need to do it this way, because people are going to look at this as the standard or an example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, there was one work where all the installation reference photos that we pulled up, like there was a screen that was quite dark. Mm-hmm. And so we sort of thought that was the case. And because you were there and you were like, well, what happened? Maybe let's just play with the screen a little bit. And we looked at it and it was like, wait, they were supposed to be even. That's right. They were. Exactly to your point, like we had done all this research and to map on these prior installation images that we were using as guardrails, but it was incorrect. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think too, like the video with bodies in it, it's also recording a performance, and the Nina Sobel, where the brain waves are being recorded, and we're watching these figures, trying to sync themselves and make these beautiful drawings. That was such an interesting piece too, because it was watching a participatory project that would be really fun to participate in, but is kind of equally important as a record, I think. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was really interesting. Yeah.
And that particular project has Nina talking about the works, and there's a sort of documentary aspect documenting the actual event, and then there are videos of people participating that she considers as a kind of brainwave drawing. Mm-hmm. So a drawing being generated by people who were part of that environment.
Cool. Well, that brings me actually to another question. I'll go through this and go back. So this was news to me, but when I talked to my mother about coming here, she was like, "Oh yeah, Winky Dinks." So apparently not that esoteric. But can you tell us about this image and about your research and what you found out about this?
Yeah, so the way I came across this program from the 1950s was actually talking to the artist Michelle Stewart, and I was trying to describe how Adina Pindel's video drawings to Michelle, and she said, "Oh, it's like Winky Dink." It's this acetate sheet that is adhered with static to the TV screen. And then I began doing some research on this children's TV program. It was shown in the 1950s. And kids could send away for what was called a magic drawing screen, which was essentially a sheet of transparent vinyl or acetate. And then they would have a set of pens that could be wiped from the screen. And the host of the show, Winky Dink, would encourage the children to either solve a mystery or interact with characters on screen. And they would draw on their domestic television screen using this vinyl sheet. So later on in the 1960s, this ends up being cancelled because there's increasing anxiety about X radiation being emitted. If any of you were ever told to sit 6 feet away from the TV screen, this is where it comes from, this real anxiety in the 60s, which did turn out to be pretty well-founded, so there was X-radiation, and they later sort of included a thicker glass panel to try and mitigate that. Another thing that was happening was that kids were just not using the magic drawing screen and drawing on the TV. But I thought it was really interesting in terms of thinking about the screen as a tactile interface, but as early as the 1950s. So now, I was doing some research earlier today, about 80% of children in the US have access to an iPad, whether it's their own or in the family, and they are using it for drawing as well as for playing games, as well as for watching videos. So some interactive purposes, some more passive consumption of images. And I think Winky Dink is a sort of precursor to that. And this is one of Howardina's video drawings where she's also using that acetate sheet, but in a much more conceptual way, with these diagrams that actually we found out she took from conservation reports, because she was working at the Museum of Modern Art and had been asked to make conservation reports. So there's this.
Oh, you mean like the markings would denote some
Like a condition issue.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yes,
she's
it's a
pulling from
condition
that
report.
language.
Previously, you'd put you'd print out a photo and you'd put it in like a sleeve, like a clear, transparent sleeve. And conservators would annotate on the outside of that sleeve.
Right.
So you wouldn't wreck the interior photo. But it was a way that would see what was wrong, if
Like
there was
the
a crack
retouching
or
or-
a
yeah.
damage or whatever. You could and then you could pull out the picture, you could see the original, and you could slide it back in.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, I was looking at this thinking about it more as, almost like the markings you make on like a storyboard, like to denote movement, but now that I look at it, that's really interesting. Yeah. All these little pieces of it. Let's see if I put another one in. Yeah, and this was the, from the project I mentioned earlier about like an early, kind of using television and making a diagram of something happening and, thinking about this close read. And Adrian Piper, of course, is like the perfect artist to think about it this way. Like, so this is can you describe this? I think you'll do a better job than I will.
So it's part of this series called the Hypothesis Situation series, where she maps her relationship to objects in her immediate vicinity. So one of them is a chair. There are other objects in the studio, but then her friend Sol Lovatt bought her a TV for her birthday, and she begins mapping her relationship to this television. And interestingly, sometimes it's turned off, and she just treats it as an object, like a chair, and maps her spatial relationship to it. But then she will also turn it on and begin to map the relationship between the characters on screen. So this is from the soap opera Peyton Place. And there's a text piece that accompanies it where instead of describing her own physical relationship to the TV set, she starts to describe what the characters are doing on screen and at what moment in time. So really creating a kind of map of how this action is unfolding. In the one where it's turned off, she talks about whether to turn the TV on or just get back to her artwork. So here we could say it is something of a pull away from her studio practice into this other world that's unfolding on the TV screen in the studio.
Yeah, I love the one with the reflections. I think I saw a show, I think it was Lee Friedlander, the photographer, with all of the reflections in American homes with, you're seeing the family and then you're seeing what's happening as this sort of overlay of time. So let's go back, because I wanted to ask you about Rauschenberg a little bit, since there's this incredible Rauschenberg show here at the Menil as well. So yeah, can you talk about this series?
Yeah.
One of you, whichever.
Would you like to, Kelly, or shall I? Yeah. So Rauschenberg famously said he liked to leave the windows of the studio open and the TV on because life can't be stopped and you have to welcome life into your art. So this sort of bombardment of imagery, which could be seen as overwhelming or undesirable for some artists, for Rauschenberg, this is something he wants. He wants to have this sort of influx of information. So in the transfer drawings, he's working with images from magazines and newspaper, and he soaks them in turpentine and then rubs over them in this scanning motion. So it really is a kind of raster motion, moving back and forth and transmitting the image from one surface to another. And interestingly, John Cage, his friend, said that the experience of looking at these drawings is like watching many television sets, all tuned differently, but all playing simultaneously. So there's a sense of switching between these different image sources that was really appealing about these drawings.
Absolutely. And I think this technique also, I mean, they're really worthwhile, as with everything, to see in person. But these do have this really incredible glow about them that I think does bring out this sense of where he's pulling this imagery from and this object he's living and working alongside. You just had an image of his studio up, and the television, we know from oral histories, was on all the time. He was also a soap opera person, as it turns out. And I think, again, this kind of experimental, how it's impacting, the thesis of the show, how it's impacting drawing practices. And this kind of glow, this kind of haunting, ghostly quality to these, it's a perfect corollary and entree into the show that our colleague Michelle White did across the street, where you have his work with fabric. So there's this really powerful connection to how images are being transmitted through light and how he brings that into his practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are so, they're so beautiful. But I also I really like these historical pictures of just what the TVs looked like in artist studios. And I love that, if you picture like an artist studio from, the 50s through 80s, like these are out of central casting. Like, you can't afford this studio anymore in New York now. It would be like a sad phone on a desk. But I do feel like there's this really interesting tension between bringing the world in and keeping the world out. And I feel that, if you go to a residency, like often you're not going to, have your television on at the residency. There's this idea of like, okay, now I need time to create, because we've become so saturated with media. And I just wonder, this, I think we talked about it with Adrian Piper, just like either keeping the world at bay or having it as a distraction or bringing it in. And it just sort of so instantly leads to like politics, like where are the Guston images? Back. Oh yes, I want to talk about these. So here's some images of just, how people were literally drawing televisions. And I thought that was such an interesting part of the show, is to deal with it as furniture. Both you're actually manhandling the technology, but also just representing it. Can either of you just talk about the inclusion of these projects?
I mean, Walter de Maria in the 60s draws a whole series of boxes emitting rays. So this fear of X radiation, which was being discussed in the media and connected to television, seems to be very present in his drawings. And bear in mind, this is also a Cold War moment. So this sort of pervasive anxiety about invisible forces that could be impacting people, even in the domestic environment, seems very pressing. Here he writes, "There's a TV in my future." So this box clearly is intended to be a television. But at other times, they're more abstract boxes that seem to have this kind of energy emanating from them. So we know that De Maria was also involved in a sort of entrepreneurial scheme to create a gigantic lens that could magnify the televised image. He envisaged it being used to screen sporting events in bars. So you would attach the screen to a small television, and it would magnify the sporting event for a crowd to watch it. So he's thinking about how TV can be used to sort of fund his artistic practice, as well as incorporating it in more conceptual ways into that practice.
I think I should try that again. That sounds really great. And yeah, what about like this Guston? I thought was really interesting. Obviously Richard Nixon, and thinking about bringing politics onto the scene. I just really like the way the chair is rendered as well, as this sort of puffy, like eggy, like squishy thing. But I thought this was a really great inclusion.
Absolutely. We were really excited about these. The exhibition has 2 examples from the 180 drawings Guston made, documenting, basically charting Richard Nixon's life. He's shows like over in images like this, there's a few that feature the television where he's like hectoring the viewer. Nixon kind of famously lost the first televised presidential debate because he wasn't television ready, right? He was sweaty. He hadn't like shaved properly or something. I don't know. So it all it all went down the pipe for him. But he came back with a vengeance and knew how to use the television. And Guston, he sort of famously turns away from abstraction to work in representation and to make images that are politically charged, to make images that engage with the Ku Klux Klan and thinking about racial injustice in the United States. But part of that turn he really attributes to the television, because the world was coming into his home. This is the era of the Vietnam War. This is the era of Watergate. So these seismic, violent acts are he's watching them every night, and he just felt he couldn't turn away anymore. He really attributes the television as to being one of the reasons why he started first making these satirical drawings and ultimately turned to large-scale representational painting.
Yeah. And I've been watching for that, and it's hard to find, because obviously this new generation of artists is contending very much with social media, but it seems to be so much the water that they're swimming in that it's hard to have that critical distance enough to do anything interesting with it. I'm sure we can, maybe think of examples of people who are struggling valiantly and coming up with some interesting stuff, but I do feel like it's that moment that you first, realize something has disrupted your innate thought pattern that you have to deal with it artistically. I went to a performance the other night of this, younger artist, Maya Mann, who's dealing with AI in this way. And it was really because of, dance moms and TikTok and this idea of 8-second of, loops where you're really watching, that you can know about a television show or a piece of media without ever having watched that TV show or piece of media because you see it advertised so much or, download it in clips. And really she's making these amazing things where she's doing AI of dance sequences. So like getting the technology, pushing it right up to the fact that it can't really do it. Like it can't really do things behind, and you get legs like flailing around in circles in weird ways. But it does feel like these artists are like, kind of trying to record this moment, and yeah, and to that end, I think this Mimi Smith work, where it's like you're trying to personalize an effect that is happening in the world that I was really interested in, and this wasn't an artist that I knew about. So can you talk about this? You really do have to go see the show because this work is invisible in PDFs or in this slide, but I'm interested in, Kelly maybe talking about Mimi's work.
Sure. Mimi Smith did a whole series of television drawings in the 1970s. She had moved her studio into her home, and so was really also living and working alongside this object, but didn't really see it as a collaborator or co-conspirator. She was more in the Piper vein of this thing is this. She even called it kind of an invader in her house. Wow. We think the iPhone feels bad, but she felt like this was like the television was her conduit to the world, but yet it was just pervading her home atmosphere with just banality, violence, just things that she didn't want in her head. And I look at these and I think of them almost as a way of like trying to exercise them or something, of just how do I, if this is going to be in my environment, how do I like process it and put it back out? So what she's doing here is that she's transcribing television broadcasts. The one here that we're looking at is the News at Noon. And this one is, quite banal. It's just like the weather reports, sport reports, like two people, just two talking heads chit-chatting with each other. But I love how she changes colors in the text depending on a shift in subject or when her transcription just couldn't keep up anymore. And then she's making these on black paper. So it's also replicating that black screen of the television.
Mm-hmm. It makes me think of, just, I guess, standard at the moment, right? Conceptual art practices of like making a codex for your work or like art and language or people, that were like using these like strategies to code things. And it feels like a huge, like, predecessor for code-based work, schematizing protocols to then create a new language.
Yeah, and she's one of many artists in the show that did have kind of crossover in their work with computing. So I think you made this comment earlier that we could probably have the same roster of artists and just show their work with computers, and we would have a whole other show. And it's not untrue, because I just think so many of these artists, to the title of the exhibition that Anna so brilliantly devised, they had resolve in working with new technologies. They were intrepid. This was not what they were taught in school. And so artists that were, for the most part, maybe just as keen to just pick up this technology and learn it on the fly and make art as they were learning about the apparatus were, for some of them, equally likely to go to a computer and try to figure out what that technology was all about and how to make work with it.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's, it doesn't always break down very neatly, but I do think that there's people, just concerned about the tools of their time. And often those tools don't seem like art-making tools, and I'm sure for people, from Fluxus forward, there were probably people going, why are you making art about television? It's like an anathema to what we considered a traditional art practice. And then there are people who just forge ahead because of some drive to do something new and different. So just to that end, I just wanted to bring these couple pictures in because, thinking about bringing computing into the mix, this was a pandemic project to build, this is the smaller version of the plotter. So it's a computer-based, software-driven, pen, but you can see it's totally what, a conservator's nightmare, a hodgepodge of there's some medical equipment in there. You can see the little tube that's feeding the ink in, and it has to attach to a compressor. And the images, I did this shot of a residency we had in Maine because they're all photographic or video-based images, so they're coming from video. And then the computer software is, manipulating them and reducing them, and then finally using software to control the drawing apparatus itself. So in a way, it kind of collapses a lot of these ideas about, machines and transcription of reality onto paper, and then you can feed any kind of, art material into it. So, this one is ink and charcoal together, acrylic paint and charcoal and watercolor paper. So just sort of this idea of stuffing the whole world into what a pen can draw, I thought would be interesting to bring into the fold.
Jennifer, when you show this work, do you show the machine in progress, or do you show the
We've
object
done
that
it
it's
all
produced?
different ways, because I do think that is part of it, is if you see plotter, people think, oh, it's a printer, but it's really an artist-made tool. So my favorite show that we've done with it is we did a show called From Lincoln to Lincoln, and it was kind of a road movie. So it's 12 giant charcoal drawings that were made of images from the Lincoln Tunnel to Lincoln, Nebraska, where the show was. And then when the drawings are around the gallery, we projected an image of the plotter doing its thing on the floor, which is nice because it also has the sound element of this, it almost sounds like a 3D printer kind of making its way across the paper. And you can watch, it's a very non-human kind of drawing, because instead of drawing the major moments and then working through the detail, it kind of hops around like crazy as a way to kind of optimize something. We're not actually sure why it's hopping, but we it's just doing that. And there's a real sort of odd sense of it, because you can kind of leave it running and come back, and sometimes it's stopped, and sometimes there's a big ink blob, and sometimes the dog has shaken the table and the whole image offsets in a strange way. So it has its it's sort of like having an animal do a drawing more than your printer. So yeah, we've done it all different ways, and people like to see the process, but in a way, it's not as tightly controlled as you would think when you hear the word plotter. It's not an architect's plotter. It's a super. It's a handmade tool that only does the ideas we want it to do, which is interesting because, talking about these artists trying to create a business out of their tools, it's a very different sensibility that you need. So let's see. Oh, we're actually. So for any of you, just one more question. So in the essay, at Anna's last paragraph, you suggest that the era that we're discussing lent itself to easily legible graphic gestures, and thinking of this as a graphic gesture and, the struggle with new media or social media. With so much technology functioning in a very invisible mode these days, like we can't unpack the televisions the way that Joy has been able to do. What gestures do you see today are legible? Or is it easy to make a legible gesture in recent projects? Like, are you seeing anything new out there that feels that it's indebted to the artists that we see in your show?
I mean, I think the idea of the glitch or the breakdown as a way of making a technology legible, like Sandra Perry's recent work and her use of AI, but also trying to push AI to see what it can't do or what it's going to do in a way that is uncanny or unsettling. I think that seems to be like an important strategy. So yes, the technology may sometimes seem transparent, but how can we render it visible through this kind of productive error or breakdown?
Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like as AI gets more perfect, it's going to become less interesting to artistic invention, possibly. So yeah, and I do think there's like this level of humanity that we search for, which is why Mimi Smith, transcribing her thoughts about the media is so much more important than her having recorded that scene and showing it. Like that sort of using the human filter, I think, is really interesting.
No, I think you really had it, Anna. It's like searching for these fail points, the way artists are searching for the fail points inside of this technology. Joan Jonas' vertical roll, the left side, right side, where she's showing that, like, this is in fact a mirror. It's not she's looking directly at this idea of real and unreal or real and illusion. But I also think there may be a little bit of, like, to take another tack, I think there are also some artists that are kind of grappling a little bit with nostalgia, like bringing it back in very legible ways. One artist that we came across is the Iraqi artist Hiwa Kay, who's based in Berlin. And he has this wonderful series, I think it's called something like My Father's Color Television, where he is remembering that when color television became available in Iraq, most families couldn't get it. So his father would take these color acetate films and like collage them on the screen to make color television. So one, it's nostalgia and thinking about this equipment, but two, thinking about kind of uneven access to these technologies across the globe. So I think there's not only the nostalgia, but also kind of this politicization that you're also seeing in something like the Perry, where thinking about deliberately ways in which technologies render certain people, render certain races invisible. Searching for the fail points, but also through this lens of who is not part of the conversation and ways in which that may be in fact intrinsic inside of the technology.
Those are great examples. I think Mariam Ghani has some interesting work too about, Afghanistan, like films at the time, and this sort of, the action movies that were made, and, thinking about this sort of completely other film industry that, was happening.
What's interesting about like thinking about access and when we're in conservation, especially with the AI notion, or, when the big, when everyone was pushing towards like whatever, the latest new technology. And I think a lot of artists are not realizing how dependent these environments are on like broader communities. That like you can't do this without the software company staying in business. And if that software update goes, your artwork breaks or something. Like there's these larger community dependencies. And what's really interesting in thinking about like these other kind of communities that maybe don't have the greater access to AI or things like that, what's really interesting is they have a much better access to analog technologies. If you're thinking about like what we're calling obsolescence is like a social construct, right? It's obsolete because we don't have the system that supports it. But those systems still exist. They just don't happen to exist here. And so it's interesting to think that we feel more disconnected, but there are many many communities that are still really quite connected to this technology and are still using it and repairing it and engaging really closely with it. These TVs are still in their homes.
Certainly, like not trading in for
Right.
it's a precious thing that can't just be thrown out because the new one came out.
So it's interesting to think that, like, in conservation, we're reaching towards, our colleagues in different places because we're, they're much closer to communities that can repair these things that, I've got a guy, north of the loop, this guy Mike, and I don't want Mike to get too old because Mike's the only guy that can repair it,
Yeah.
but there's other places that have whole communities that are doing this and developing it. And so it's, I always think it's really interesting to see, that it's not just this push towards the end, there's technology drops out based on the communities that cease to exist to support it.
Yeah. Are you doing ongoing emulation with some of the work in the Menil collection?
One of the probably the most prominent examples is the Max Newhouse at the entry of the museum. There's a sound installation. It's unmarked if you haven't heard it. It's when you walk in, and it was installed in 2007, and Max Newhouse built his own website and his own software, and the website's built in 2007 to monitor the artwork, and it sent him an email every single morning to tell him how his artwork was doing. And when he passed away, that email now gets forwarded to me, so it's a very weird, kind of responsibility of it. But it was operating on, every kind of system, where it was on a, it was on a Mac Mini, it was on a MacBook Pro, it was on all these things when you realize, Mac is not the answer to legacy and longevity. And we just last summer migrated it to operate on a Raspberry Pi.
Great.
To bring it back to this simple technology. It's a simple software, and that allows it to operate and to be repairable moving forward. Whereas
so
the
it
Mac
became a
environment is
kind
not.
of single-use appliance. Yeah, we learned that the hard way once. We had this major projection video at the gallery we showed with in New York. And, it was like our everyday computer that we just moved into the gallery. And one day the gallerist called and she was like, "Jennifer, you have lunch with Lyle Ashton Harris today," because the alert came on the screen and she couldn't shut it off. So we sort of learned the hard way that you want to have the artwork have a single
Isolated
purpose
environments.
machine.
Yeah, isolated environments. And we did that here, when you think about how we brought in all these artworks. It's really easy to lose video art. It's really easy to misplace it. It's easy to duplicate it. If you someone emailed us the video and it got downloaded to everybody's computers and then they forwarded it along, it's kind of a funny, this reduplication.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's just fine, and other times it's such a violation of a museum care for an artwork.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all this sort of aging stuff. I think the artist in New York, Raphael Shirley, one of her main jobs is to fly around, fixing Namjoon Pike pieces. And, there's a body, in her body is this knowledge of, all of these systems and work. But, just maintaining the documentation to move that forward has got to keep everyone up at night, trying to stay ahead of it a little bit. Yeah. Well, this is really great. Yes. I would love to hear questions from the audience if anyone wants to ask these amazing experts about this show or any of the topics that we covered.
If you raise your hand, I'll bring the mic around.
Thank you.
It's ironic that you used the word Mike. You had talked about your guy on the north side, Mike. Can you speak a little bit about the different talent outside of the museum walls that you brought in for this exhibition, please? Thank you. It was great.
We worked a lot with BAML TV, which is north outside the loop, and they repair TVs, and they've been repairing TVs for many, many decades. So it was really helpful to have them come in and help us tune the TVs. It was interesting with the Nina Sobel piece. We had it on the physical monitor we wanted to see it on, but the color presentation just wasn't good enough, and it was really funny to have, BAML sent down their technician, Bob. So Bob from BAML was here. And I spent, a couple days, and he's really kind of like this guy's like, "I'll fix your TV." And I got it. And so we're looking at it, he's like, "What, this color's not good? The color's terrible on this." He's like, "What?" And it's interesting to do an interface between the technicians and those who want to see kind of video perfection and we're giving them these, these works that have been migrated through media upon media upon media. I mean, we're probably on the 8th or 9th generation of remastered format. So it's the resolution and there's so much noise and there's all kinds of different artifacts of its history of people trying to preserve it and trying to give it forward. And so it's interesting to have the translation between the two and be like, can you just adjust the color? I need something with the color better.
Were they shot on, what was the original format of video? Was it open reel, or was it 3/4 inch or 1 inch?
I think it was various for the different, and there was the 3 artists that were all working on the same
Yes,
camcorder, right?
Annabella Geiger.
Yeah.
Right, they just were passing it
Letizia
around.
Parente, they had access to one video camera, and they passed it around their circle of artists in Brazil.
I think it was a curator had brought it from the U.S. because it wasn't commercially available in Brazil. So a curator had brought it because he thought, we have great artists that can also make great video art. So they all passed around the same Portapak camera and all made. And so the videos that we have in the show by Letizia Parente and Annabella Geiger were likely made on the same video camera.
And their quality, though, is quite different, which is funny. They're when you go look at them side by side, they've lived very different lives as, these artworks that have been moved forward, and they originated from the same place. That question of stewardship is so important to, generations later of display.
Yeah, I also have to shout out to the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, Caroline and Kirsten, Ben and Adrian, and all just seismically generous colleagues with your knowledge. Conservators are just so generous and in general with your knowledge. I mean, the way you all rely on each other and build communities around sharing this knowledge. There's no hoarding the expertise. The expertise is for giving out. But the other thing that I learned from people is basically the CRT experts are Bob Bammel and his cohort, time-based media conservators, and gamers. Gamers know how to repair the CRT TVs because they want to play these old video games. So those are the experts. Those are the people that know how to fix the CRT.
And a big shout out to Electronic Parts Outlet. If you haven't been out to EPO, they are incredible in what repair they're doing here in Houston, and they're worth supporting because those types of shops are so rare. And they keep a kind of deposit, so I could call him and ask him I got this question. He's like, I got a guy, and he's connecting this community of people in this circle of, that want this technology to continue on, and he's not throwing things away, and he's really excited about what he's keeping. So it's definitely a community.
Hello. Oh, it's on. Thank you for the really very rich and fruitful discussion. It was really great to see. I'm kind of struck by a couple of different things, like the idea of participation, us as the viewer beholding the video work, and also hearing the interest in trying to push the technology into error points. And I'm kind of curious if there's any mention or thought around video, because I'm in the gallery. I noticed that as I was kind of watching works that were about kind of feminine performance, like Susie Lake and the Catherine Ellis, the True Drawings on Glass. I'm kind of wondering how does surveillance kind of complicate the relationship with the screen and TV, because it was also mentioned earlier in the discussion there's different kinds of TV, and then there's the TV that we had at our home, the TV that's in the security office. So I'm just curious if there is any conversation around that.
Yeah, I think all of the women artists in that room are very conscious of this idea of being surveilled and also of being bombarded with images of women on television. So I think they're sort of moving between these images they're seeing on television and also the sense of themselves as being these objects of surveillance, and how that might be borne out through looking at oneself in a mirror or a monitor, these different ways of interacting with your own image and of being sort of literally self-conscious. So I do think surveillance is important to them. And I think CCTV is beginning to be used by that point as well. So this other use of the CRT screen seems to be relevant, as well as television and artist video too.
Certainly. And I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of videos in that gallery also have diagrammatic drawing, so drawing where people are being quantified and parceled out. I think it's definitely part of that, that kind of surveillance, that kind of categorization that happens through a surveilled system.
I was thinking about a contemporary work that I thought was one of the most exciting uses of surveillance. The artist Jill Magid, who like embeds her, she'll go do deep research, and she did a project where she was in a public space in the UK, and she worked with the technicians to keep her on camera so that she's walking through this space, but the whole video is made of surveillance footage that is permanent cameras in this train hall. And so she's in like a red dress, and then the camera just follows her and tracks everything. And it was at the, it was sort of at the sort of same time as the discussion of the UK is the most surveilled culture on the planet, with cameras everywhere. And she sort of used a public system to make a video of herself. So she's kind of relying on corporate or governmental surveillance to make a self-portrait. It's a super interesting piece. There's also another artist that I was into in the 90s a lot named Julia Scher, who had this whole project, Surveillance by Julia, and she would set up these, very like elaborate museum systems with, and she had a character of like a security officer that she would play that was kind of this interesting narrative with it. But yeah, it's very interesting to think about that. Kevin and I did a project too that I thought was great at the very beginning of like the idea of a webcam. And so we got really interested in that, even though people would set up these webcams in offices, but because offices all look the same, you could be in like, Dubai or Los Angeles, and all the offices were the same because corporate cubicles are the same. So we did like a display where we had all of these surveillance images sucked into like a 4-part monitor, but they came from all over the world. So I kind of missed the early heady days of like just putting cameras online everywhere. Now it's a little bit more locked down and you can't access them so easily, but there was many good art things done with like squirrel cams and, bird cams and, that kind of project I think is still really interesting.
And, you all are surveilled as you're watching the entire show. I get to see all the security footage of all of you getting too close to the artwork. But,
yeah,
and so we're like the levels of surveillance. And it's also interesting talking about the presentation with the headphones. And every single one you sit down and it's a quiet kind of thing. But it was interesting because a lot of the artists that we were reaching out about, like, what's your ideal presentation mode? And not every single one, but many of them were like, big screen, all by itself, lots of sound, and then you're like, well, we need to put it in a room with these other works. Oh, it's great to be by them too, and it was kind of like happy to do it. But you can see the difference in it turns into something much different and much more intimate when you have these kind of, like these heavy headphones on, and it's low, and it, like you're sitting in front of these monitors. You're supposed to sit down and watch. So there is, a certain, even I think built into it, like of how the exhibition is built of, and the technology you're looking at.
Well, I mean, even 10 years after the latest piece, this idea of video art becomes very much more cinematic and installation based, and this show is incredible, but it is not cinematic. It is televisual.
Yes, yes.
The small screen.
Well, I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have a question on like showing, like when you're presenting video art, do you think, like what other possibilities other than just loops of the video going on over and over again are there? Like, could you like fragment it and then, I don't know, change the order as it's going? Or would that have to be like the artist presenting it that way?
It's interesting. We just acquired a work by Mark Bauer, and it's, 67 seconds long. And it was, when we acquired the work, they sent me 7 different files. And I was like, what's the real one? Like, which one's the artwork? Because it was 3 different resolutions. There was one that was just the single. There was one that was looped 7 times. And then there was one that was looped like 10 times. And I was like, is there supposed to be a pause? You know, and it was interesting to think, and I went back with Mark Bauer's studio quite a lot, just being like, why did you send me all of this? What is their purpose? And it was interesting because he wanted to show the 7-time loop was to show that there should be no black space in between the looping. You know, and that's interesting because when we were encoding all this video, so we're saying video art, all this art has been digitized. So all of these are playing on bright sign players that you cannot see. So, you know, it's all like, they're all on SD cards, which, you know, is kind of wild to think that all this is, you know, you can also just plug into your, you know, your SD card reader. And we had to, when we were programming all of this to replay, was thinking about like, what is an appropriate amount of black screen in between, shorter or longer? And there was certain times when it was really important that it was long, or it was really important that it was short or totally seamless. And then, you know, with longer pieces, it's interesting that maybe you don't want your audience to walk in halfway through. Mm-hmm. And so we're thinking about, you know, we're going to be showing a John Acumpha piece next year, and thinking about that piece, I think it's 56 minutes long, and showing those as times, as, you know, screening times. Mm-hmm. Or thinking about Tacita Dean's pieces that we had on 16mm film. She had us wire up a push button to a 16mm projector. And if you play with 16mm projectors, you know how ridiculous this is. Mm-hmm. But the viewer, it was a 2-minute film, and you got to press the button. So when you got to walk in, you got to see it start for you. So there's a lot of really interesting things. I think it has a lot to do, though, with audience interaction and thinking about who's it for, and are you supposed to see it from the start to end, and how do you interact and engage with it?
Mm-hmm. And I think there's a whole, you know, slew of artists that deal a lot with furniture in the gallery, you know, very specific configurations that people can sit in. And I always really appreciate that. I do know, just to like carve out the entire like visual environment that you're supposed to encounter, you know, slumped on the floor, sitting on a bleacher, you know, all those things are really, I think, cool in terms of presentation. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jennifer.
I loved your question. I never heard of it. Yeah.